What happens when one of Hollywood's most respected actresses sits down for what is supposed to be a routine interview and instead turns into one of the most explosive confrontations ever seen on daytime television? Today, we're breaking down the shocking moment when Meryl Streep completely dismantled Joy Behar live on The View, leaving the entire studio frozen in stunned silence. This is the kind of raw, unfiltered television networks hope never airs, but when it does, it becomes history. Be sure to subscribe and leave a comment below, because you won't believe how this unfolds. The morning began like any other at the View Studios. Meryl Streep had been scheduled for what producers assumed would be a straightforward, promotional appearance for her latest film. The Oscar winner, long admired for her poise and professionalism, took her seat as the cameras rolled and the theme music faded. Joy Behar, seated in her usual spot, wore that familiar smirk viewers know all too well, the one that signals she's about to stir the pot. "So, Mariel," Joy began, leaning forward with exaggerated interest, "tell us about this new movie of yours." Then she added, "I have to say, when I read the synopsis, I wondered if Hollywood is just running out of original ideas these days." The other hosts, Whoopi Goldberg, Sarah Haynes, and the rest of the panel exchanged quick looks. It was an unusually sharp opening, even for Joy, who is known for blunt commentary. Mariel, however, kept her composure, offering a polite smile. "Well, Joy, storytelling has always involved revisiting themes that resonate with the human experience," she replied calmly. "This particular film explores the complexity of family dynamics during times of crisis, which feels especially relevant given what families have been through recently." Joy waved her hand dismissively. "Oh, please, Mariel. Let's be honest. You've built a career playing the same tortured woman again and again. The crying, the dramatic monologues, the whole suffering artist routine. Don't you think audiences are tired of watching you cry on screen for 2 hours?" The studio fell noticeably quiet. Even the production crew seemed to pause. Whoopi cleared her throat, clearly uneasy with where the interview was heading. Sarah suddenly found her notes fascinating. Mariel's smile remained, but something shifted in her eyes. "That's an interesting perspective, Joy," she said. "I'm curious, what would you consider authentic storytelling? Because from where I sit, exploring human emotion and vulnerability is exactly what art is meant to do." "Authentic?" Joy scoffed, her voice rising slightly. "Authentic would be admitting you've been coasting on your reputation for decades. You get nominated because it's Meryl Streep, not because the performances are actually remarkable anymore. It's like the emperor's new clothes, and everyone's too afraid to say it." The tension in the room was now unmistakable. Cameras kept rolling as the other hosts sat in stunned silence. This was no playful back and forth. It felt personal, hostile, and deeply unprofessional. Mariel set down her water glass and looked directly at Joy. "I see," she said evenly. "So you believe recognition comes from some kind of industry conspiracy rather than craft and dedication?" Her voice stayed calm, but there was steel beneath the politeness. "Tell me, Joy, what's your background in performance? What qualifies you to make such sweeping judgments about artistic merit?" Joy's face flushed slightly. "I don't need to be a chef to know when food tastes bad, Mariel. And I've been in this business long enough to recognize manufactured excellence when I see it." "This business?" Mariel repeated, lifting an eyebrow. "You mean television hosting? Because real acting requires a level of vulnerability and skill I'm not sure you'd understand. It's not about delivering opinions from behind a desk." The other hosts began actively trying to redirect the conversation. Whoopi jumped in. "Ladies, maybe we should talk about the film itself, the story, the characters." But Joy refused to back down. "Oh, here comes the superiority complex," she shot back. You think a pile of awards makes you untouchable? Let me tell you something, sweetheart. I've been calling out Hollywood phonies since before you were putting on those ridiculous accents in every other movie. Mariel's composure finally cracked just slightly. Phonies? That's rich coming from someone whose entire career is built on manufactured outrage and uninformed commentary. You want to talk about authentic? Let's talk about what's authentic about sitting here every day, spouting opinions on subjects you clearly don't understand, while real artists are out there actually creating something meaningful. The words hung in the air like smoke. Joy's mouth opened and closed, for once failing to produce her usual quick comeback. The studio audience, which had been murmuring softly, went completely silent. Even the camera operators seemed frozen, unsure whether to keep filming this career-ending moment or cut to commercial. Sarah tried desperately to smooth things over. I think what's wonderful about art is that it means different things to different people. No, Mariel interrupted, her voice calm but firm. I think Joy has made her position quite clear. She believes that expertise, training, and decades of craft mean nothing compared to her personal opinions delivered from a place of comfort and safety. It's fascinating, really, this idea that criticism without understanding somehow equals insight. Joy finally found her voice again, but it sounded sharper and more defensive than her usual confrontational tone. Don't you dare lecture me about understanding. I've been watching movies since before you were even thinking about acting. I know what I see, and what I see is someone who thinks she's above criticism. Above criticism? Mariel laughed, though it wasn't a pleasant sound. Joy, I've been criticized by some of the most brilliant minds in film and theater. The difference is that those critics understood what they were evaluating. They could discuss technique, emotional truth, the relationship between text and performance. You're offering nothing but personal attacks disguised as professional commentary. The words struck Joy like a slap. Her cheeks reddened as she realized Mariel had just publicly dismantled her entire approach to commentary in front of millions of viewers. But instead of backing down or acknowledging the point, Joy doubled down in the worst possible way. Personal attacks? Joy's voice cracked slightly as she leaned forward aggressively. You want to talk about personal attacks? Let me tell you what's personal. Watching someone like you parade around Hollywood for 40 years, acting like you're doing Shakespeare when half the time you're just putting on funny voices and calling it acting. You think you're Katharine Hepburn, but honey, you're not even close. The studio went completely silent except for the hum of the cameras. Whoopi pressed her hand to her forehead, clearly regretting every decision that had led to this moment. Sarah looked like she wanted to crawl under the desk. In the control room, producers frantically debated whether this was a disaster or the most compelling television they had ever captured. Mariel leaned back in her chair, and for a moment everyone thought she might take the high road and end the interview. Instead, she folded her hands in her lap and spoke with a quiet intensity that made everyone lean forward. Joy, I'm going to do something for you that it's clear no one in your life has had the courage to do. I'm going to tell you the truth. Her voice was steady, but there was fire behind it. You've built a career on being deliberately inflammatory because actual insight requires work, study, and intellectual honesty. You confuse volume with authority and controversy with relevance. Joy's mouth fell open. How dare you? I'm not finished, Mariel continued, cutting through Joy's protest like a knife. You want to compare me to Katharine Hepburn? Fine. Hepburn was fearless, intelligent, and never punched down. She challenged power, not artists trying to do meaningful work. You, on the other hand, have made a living off cheap shots and surface-level observations. The difference between us isn't just talent, Joy. It's character. The silence that followed was deafening. Joy's face drained from red to pale, and for the first time in her career on The View, she appeared genuinely speechless. The other hosts froze, unsure whether to intervene or let the moment run its course. Finally, Joy spoke, but her voice came out as a strangled whisper. "You think you can come on my show and humiliate me?" "Your show?" Mariel's eyebrows shot up. "Joy, this is The View. It belongs to all of you and, more importantly, to the viewers who tune in expecting thoughtful discussion, not petty attacks on guests. But since you mentioned humiliation, let me ask you this. When was the last time you created anything? When did you last put yourself out there, vulnerable and exposed, for people to judge?" Joy's voice turned shrill. "I create conversation. I create dialogue. I ask the tough questions everyone else is afraid to ask." "You create conflict," Mariel corrected firmly. "There's a difference between tough questions and cheap attacks. A tough question about my work would be about my process, my choices, the themes I'm drawn to. Instead, you opened with insults disguised as observations. That's not journalism, Joy. That's not even good entertainment. It's just cruel." Whoopi finally tried to regain control. "Ladies, I think we need to take a breath here maybe." But Joy wasn't finished. The humiliation of being called out so publicly had pushed her past rational thought. "You know what, Mariel? You want to talk about cruel? Cruel is watching someone your age still trying to play ingenues in movies. Cruel is pretending every performance you give is a masterpiece when we can all see you're just doing the same thing, over and over in different costumes." The attack was so personal and vicious that even the camera operators looked uncomfortable. Sarah gasped audibly. Whoopi shook her head in disbelief. Mariel, instead of taking the bait, did something unexpected. She smiled. "Thank you, Joy," she said quietly. "You've just proven my point better than I ever could." She turned to the camera, addressing the audience at home. "Ladies and gentlemen, what you're witnessing right now is what happens when someone is confronted with their own limitations. Instead of self-reflection or professional discourse, we get personal attacks about age and appearance." Joy realized she had walked straight into a trap of her own making. "I didn't mean—" "Oh, but you did," Mariel interrupted, turning back to her. "And that tells us everything we need to know about your character and your qualifications to judge anyone else's work. You think attacking a woman's age is clever commentary. You think ageism disguised as criticism makes you edgy and relevant." Joy was visibly flustered now, her confidence completely shattered. "I've been doing this longer than—" "Longer doesn't mean better, Joy," Mariel said firmly. "It just means you've been making the same mistakes for a longer period of time. And if this is what you consider professional behavior after all these years, maybe it's time to re-evaluate your approach." The other hosts sat in stunned silence as Joy struggled to regain her composure. Her face was flushed, her hands trembling slightly, and for the first time since joining The View, she looked genuinely vulnerable. But any sympathy she might have received had already been burned away by her earlier attacks. Sarah made one final attempt to salvage the interview. "Perhaps we could talk about the message of your film, Mariel, and how it relates to current." "Actually," Mariel said, standing from her chair, "I think we've covered quite enough for today. Joy has made it clear she's more interested in personal attacks than professional discussion, and I don't see any reason to continue this conversation." Joy's voice came out as a croak. "You can't just leave in the middle of an interview." Mariel paused and looked down at her with something that might have been pity. "Joy, you stopped conducting an interview the moment you decided to make this personal. What we have now is you embarrassing yourself on national television while I try to maintain some semblance of dignity for both of us." The studio was so quiet you could hear the hum of the air conditioning. Mariel stood poised and dignified while Joy sat slumped in her chair, the reality of what had just happened beginning to sink in. The other hosts looked like they were witnessing a car accident in slow motion, unable to look away, yet desperately wishing they could. Joy made one last desperate attempt to save face. "Fine, walk away. That's what people like you do when you can't handle real questions." Mariel paused, her hand resting on the back of her chair, and slowly turned around. The look in her eyes was pure steel. "Real questions, Joy? Let me show you what a real question looks like." She sat back down but perched on the edge of her seat, leaning forward with laser focus. "Here's a real question for you. In all your years on television, can you name a single instance where your confrontational approach actually led to meaningful insight or positive change?" Joy's mouth opened, but no words came out. The question hung in the air like a challenge everyone knew she couldn't meet. "Here's another one." Mariel continued relentlessly. "Can you explain to your viewers why you think personal attacks qualify as professional journalism? Because that would actually be educational for everyone watching." Whoopi tried to step in again. "Mariel, maybe we should—" "No, Whoopi," Mariel said firmly, never taking her eyes off Joy. Joy wanted real questions. "These are real questions. They're about professional standards, about the responsibility that comes with having a platform, about the difference between challenging people and simply bullying them." Joy finally found her voice, but it was weak and defensive. "I'm not a bully. I ask tough questions. Sometimes people don't like that." "There's the problem right there," Mariel said, shaking her head. "You think being disliked for asking probing questions is the same as being disliked for being needlessly cruel. They're not the same thing, Joy. One is journalism. The other is just bad behavior with a television contract." The cameras kept rolling as Joy struggled to respond. Her usual quick wit had completely abandoned her. She glanced around the table, silently hoping one of her co-hosts would come to her rescue. But Sarah stared down at her hands, and Whoopi looked as though she was calculating how many minutes remained until the commercial break. "Let me give you an example of the difference," Mariel continued, her tone shifting to that of a teacher addressing a struggling student. A real question might have been, "Mariel, your latest film explores themes of resilience in the face of adversity. Given your long career, what have you learned about finding truth in difficult emotional territory?" That would have been challenging and substantive. Joy tried to interrupt. "That's not—" "Instead," Mariel continued, "you chose to open with insults about my career trajectory and suggest my success is somehow fraudulent. That's not journalism, Joy. That's not even good gossip. It's just mean-spirited noise designed to provoke conflict rather than understanding." The devastation was complete. Joy looked around the table one last time, but found no support, no lifeline, no escape from the hole she had dug herself into. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "I've been doing this for years. I know how to conduct an interview." Mariel's response was swift and final. "Joy, knowing how to do something and actually doing it well are two entirely different things." "You've been talking for years," Mariel continued, "but that doesn't mean you've been communicating effectively. There's a difference between having opinions and having insight, between being provocative and being productive." Sarah made one final, desperate attempt to salvage something from the wreckage. "I think what's important is that we can have different perspectives and still respect." "Respect?" Mariel repeated, turning to Sarah with a sad smile. "Yes, that's exactly what's been missing here. Respect for the craft. Respect for the guest. Respect for the audience who tuned in expecting thoughtful discussion rather than a verbal ambush." Joy's last shred of dignity finally snapped. "You think you're so much better than everyone else, don't you? You think your little speeches make you superior?" Mariel stood again, but this time her demeanor had changed. There was sadness in her eyes, disappointment rather than anger. "Joy, I don't think I'm better than anyone. But I do think we all have a responsibility to be better than our worst impulses. Today, you chose to give in to yours. And now you're trying to make that choice my fault. She gathered her purse and turned to the camera one final time. To the viewers at home, I apologize that what should have been a conversation about storytelling and art became something much uglier. That was never my intention when I agreed to be here today. Joy made one last feeble attempt to regain control. Well, maybe next time you'll think twice before coming on a show where we ask real questions. Mariel paused at the edge of the set and delivered the final blow with devastating calm. Joy, the tragedy isn't that you ask difficult questions. The tragedy is that you think what you did here today qualifies as asking questions at all. Real journalism requires curiosity, preparation, and respect for both your subject and your audience. What you did was none of those things. As Mariel walked off the set, her heels clicking against the studio floor, the silence that followed was deafening. Joy sat frozen, her face pale, her hands trembling slightly as the full weight of her professional humiliation settled in. Whoopi looked directly into the camera, her expression saying everything about how the show's veteran host felt about what had just transpired. "We'll be right back," she said quietly, and the cameras finally cut away, leaving Joy alone with the consequences of her own behavior and the knowledge that millions of viewers had just watched her be completely dismantled by one of the most respected actresses in the world. The confrontation was over, but its impact would be felt long after the cameras stopped rolling. Joy Behar had picked a fight with Meryl Streep and lost in the most public and devastating way possible, proving that sometimes, when you try to tear someone down, you end up revealing far more about yourself and your target. What did you think of this absolutely explosive confrontation? Have you ever seen a guest dismantle a host like this before? Drop your thoughts in the comments below and be sure to subscribe for more incredible moments like this.